Chuck Richards, the founder of CoreValue Software, started his professional life on a mission inspired by his hometown. Growing up in Springfield, Vermont, he saw his hometown lose fully half of its jobs within one generation and was determined to find out why. In an extended series of discussions, Paul Stukel, founder and CEO of President and CEO Magazine, speaks with Chuck about the problems he identified for privately held middle-market companies and what can be done about them.
So, Chuck, I know you came out of the advisory world and had a very successful and long practice with that. Can you tell me sort of how you got from the advisory practice into sort of CoreValue software?
Sure. The advisory practice was actually an outgrowth of a problem I've been trying to solve for the better part of 30 years. So to go back to the beginning, I grew up in a very small town in Vermont. When I was a kid, it was the wealthiest town in Vermont. By the time I went off to college, it was the poorest town in Vermont. In a matter of a decade, a town of 10,000 people lost 5,000 jobs. And so when I went off to college, I started to look for the answer to how could a town collapse, how could a local economy collapse, and studied economics. And there were no answers in economics. Went from there, went to MIT and was in the PhD program to basically apply process engineering type solutions to business problems. So we think about the business as an engine, and we'd want to make the engine run better. So how do you make the engine run better using some algorithms and thinking from process engineering? And we were crossing over to the Harvard Business School. And so that was the early days. People were pioneering that kind of thinking. My plan in life was to be an academic. My wife's plan in life was to feed the kids, and our 4 kids won out. So I didn't stay on in academia, and I ended up going out with folks I'd met at MIT and other places and started to build companies. So I built 5 companies by myself with others, and at the end of that run had done well enough that I really wanted to circle back and see if I could solve what I called the Springfield problem. So in other words, how could a town or a local economy collapse? And it turned out that the answer is really quite simple. And the answer is that the owners of the major companies were all of the same generation. So the failure was really a failure to be able to transfer the companies and the knowledge to the next generation. So once I understood the basis of the problem, I said to myself, okay, well, first and foremost, how big is the problem? Because if it's a small problem, you can have a small solution. If it's a big problem, you need to deal with it differently. And it turns out it's a very big problem. In fact, it's the largest economic challenge facing this country. So if you think about the numbers, there are 6+ million private businesses in the U.S. that have payrolls. Of those companies, 75% plus are owned by baby boomers, and those companies represent around 30 to 40% of our job base. The scary statistic is the rate of being able to transfer to new owners, only 10% make it through. Or another way to think of it, there's almost a 90% failure rate for business to transfer to the next generation or to new owners. So if you put all those numbers together, what we're saying is there's a huge demographic wave coming of all these private companies, which have a lot of our job base inside of them, a lot of our intellectual knowledge inside of them, and the vast majority will never move to new owners. So it's a huge challenge for this country. That I then understood. Then the question became, okay, well, how do you solve the problem? And I went back to academia and started to look at it, and I was at the Kennedy School at Harvard and saying, okay, are there any macro policies? Is there anything that we can do on tax or other kinds of policies that could help fix this problem? And the answer is they're not. There's no physical, monetary, or macro policies that can fix this problem. It really is a micro problem. And the micro problem is this, and it's really a business challenge, which is how do you make businesses valuable? Because if a business is valuable, then somebody else will want to own it. So the fundamental challenge is how do you make a private business valuable? And that led to the advisory practice called Chairman's View. So Chairman's View was all about taking all of the research and the algorithms and the knowledge that I'd accumulated over 20 years of studying and building businesses, and how do you apply that to a private business at the owner or the CEO level? So Chairman's View was an advisory practice we ran for about a decade, And what we did is we go in and work with the CEOs and the owners, and our goal was to make the businesses valuable. And we were 95% successful. We would go in and use algorithms and processes, and we'd make the businesses valuable. So kind of an example of one is we went into a trucking company. And we came in because I was representing, I was actually the chairman of a trucking company. We went in to buy this company. And this truck company we wanted to buy was really interesting. So we went in to talk to the owners. It looked like a pretty easy deal to do. All the numbers made sense. And within a half an hour, we knew we couldn't do the deal. There was just no way of doing that deal with them. And so it turned out we were the 32nd buyer over 2 years to come in to look at buying that company. The conversation started, and I started to talk to the owners, and they understood what Chairman Zhu did. And they said, can you come back and talk with us? Came back in a couple of weeks, and we had a conversation with them. And it turns out they were two owners. They were a couple. And it turns out the issue was when we came in as buyers, we had no transparency into the operations. We absolutely could see their financials. Their financials were great and wonderful and well done. But when we started to try and understand how they generated those numbers, how they operationally made it happen, there was no transparency. So in essence, there was no way of transferring those financial results from the past into the future, and that's why they couldn't sell.
And that's the key word, isn't it? It's being transferable. That's really the key word. Yeah. Exactly.
Because when somebody buys something, they're buying it for its future output or future results. So if you go buy a car, the fact that someone else used it before you and got 50,000 miles, that's great. But you really care about the next 50 or the next 100,000 miles. It's the same with a business. When a buyer comes in and they want to take over the business, it's great that it made revenue and profit in the past, but what they really care about is what kind of revenue and profit will it generate for them. And if you can't help them understand that, if you can't give them transparency into the operation so they go, okay, this is truly transferable to me, then they will never buy. And it's one of the reasons where when people do have deals, letter of intent on private companies, over half of those are never closed. They perish in due diligence. It's because people can't find a way to prove to themselves, meaning the buyer, that they can really get their arms around this company and make it valuable for them.
In the second part of our Meet in the Middle discussion with CoreValue founder Chuck Richards, we'll explore the 18 value driver framework underpinning what became CoreValue software. Check back at presidentandceomagazine.com for the continuation of our discussion with Chuck.